All right, folks, thanks for coming out this evening. We're here with Jane Hardy, who was a lecturer in political science in University of Hertfordshire in the UK for a number of years. The Trade Union Department of People for Profit is very pleased to have her and that she's accepted the invitation for tonight. We invited her here to talk about trade union organizing under the title Winning Workers and Taking on Precarity. Jane is doubly qualified to talk about this topic because she is an active trade unionist herself. And in her professional role, she worked as a researcher and writer on the very same topic. So she's been an activist and a committee member in UCU through their work. We'd all know this union from the 2018 strikes, I'm sure. But the principal reason we have her here is her professional discipline as a researcher and writer. She's been researching and lecturing on the topic of industrial relations and trade unionism and the changing world of work for many years. She has a new book coming out, and it's quite accessible and comprehensive. It's aimed at activists in trade unions, and this will be out this summer. It's called Nothing to Lose But Our Chains. Her discussion of precarity and the repackaging by capitalists of offloading the businesses' risks and losses in intensive and labor-intensive businesses, and the imposition of irregular work, calling it the gig economy. That's kind of what interested me the most about it. And we know a lot about that here in Ireland, of course. We've got a lot of precarious work. We see it all the time, a lot of high-profile stuff, bogus self-employment in RTE itself, the delivery workers campaign, which we're working on continuously, the Building Workers Know Your Rights campaign. I saw Gus MacDonald come in there. We can do a lot to help in this, and that's one of the reasons that we've put together a trade union department of People for Profit. We can help organize directly, as we've been doing with delivery riders. We can encourage our unions to organize more. We're beginning to focus more on social and care work. These are areas that aren't well organized. It's a lot of migrant labor, and that gets neglected a lot of times. Happening today, we also need some bigger changes around legislation and what's happening in the north, what People for Profit's offices up there are doing with the Trade Union Freedom Bill needs to be especially underlined. And I think this is an ideal meeting to do that. So I hope that someone brings that up in the comments and questions at the end. And we need to keep supporting every strike that we see. So supporting the Debenhams workers, absolutely. Supporting the further education colleges that were out today. That's ideal, and that's what we need to get each of our branches and members really, really good at doing. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Jane brings a wealth of stories and ideas and connections. So the floor is hers. Jane, take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'm very pleased to be invited and to be here. And what got me writing the book was a frustration with the use of the word precarity and the fact that there were lots of little disputes going on that weren't recognised, that were going under the radar. So, as John said, I think we need to take on the idea of precarious work in two ways. First of all, we have to really deconstruct it a bit and think about the way that it's used as a hammer to try and keep down workers and tell them that it's too difficult to organise. And secondly, we have to look at some concrete examples, no magic bullets, but there are some really good examples of where the most vulnerable workers who've been written off have had some really good victories. So, one argument is that there is a growing number of precarious workers, and that the problem with this in the sort of school of hand-wringing is that what it's done is undermined the ability of the working class to organise and engage in struggle. And I think we have to take on that idea. Now, the idea of precariousness goes back quite a long way, but in Britain particularly, it's associated with Guy Standing, who you might have heard of, who wrote a book called The Precariat. In fairness to him, what he did was brought to our attention some very poor working conditions and insecure contracts. But there are lots of problems with his work. He sees the working class as very clearly divided between a salariat, those with good jobs, with pensions, and those on insecure work. And I think the problem with that is it's divisive, it's pessimistic, and it actually exaggerates what's happening to work. Now, we have to be specific, and I'm only going to be talking really about what's happened in Britain, because I think we have to understand that legal frameworks, the organisation of unions and struggle is on the one hand international, but it's also very specific. So I can't really go into this in a great deal of detail, but Guy Standing, who's a little bit of a straw target, but he doesn't come up with any numbers. His definitions are poor. Everyone's lumped in there, the old, the young, people on insecure contracts, the self-employed, part-timers, and that isn't really very helpful in terms of us thinking about the specificity of exploitation and how we can organise around that. I think another problem, and I'll be quite quick on this, is that it's historically very blind, and geographically as well. But in the 19th century, nobody had full-time secure work. In fact, people usually work by the hour or the half day. Now, maybe that's not controversial, but one of the yardsticks that's quite often used by people is that there was somehow a standard contract in the period from 1945. Now, that's simply not the case. Even in the most basic of industries, iron and steel, shipbuilding, there were large amounts of insecurity and flexible workers. But that idea of the standard contract never existed at all in building works, in the docks, film workers, and for women and migrant workers, they were almost completely outside of those privileged jobs. So we have to be very careful about thinking that there was some golden age of work which we're trying to get back to. I think another really unhelpful misconception about precariousness is that somehow workers in the private sector are precarious and everyone in the public sector has it good. A few years ago, Zizek talked about a sort of a salaried bourgeoisie in the public sector. But if we look since 2008, the experience of people in the public sector has been one of cuts, of outsourcing, of targets and metrics, and working in the public sector is often badly paid, but nearly always stressful. So, nevertheless, there are sectors that are hard to organise in or who have never been organised. And if we look at the problem directly, in Britain, 50% of workers in the public sector are unionised, but compared with only 13% in the private sector. So that is a real challenge for trade unions. Now, what I'm going to do very briefly is just outline some of the strategies that trade unions have used to try and organise, let's call them hard to reach workers, which quite often, but not always, overlap with migrant workers, with black workers, with women workers. And I'll go through them very briefly. Some of them you might be very familiar with. But one idea has been the idea of community unionism. There's no universal definition of this, and it's most developed in the United States and very much focused on workers who are badly served by mainstream unions. And I guess one form of community unionism, rather than relying on workers' self-organisation, has tended to rely on broad-based campaigns. And some of them have had some success. And one in Britain that has carried some of those politics was the East London Community Organisation that had, in the early part of the millennium, in 2001, quite a successful campaign to win the living wage for cleaners in Canary Wharf in particular. And it was comprised of 40 affiliated community and union organisations, but it relied on a sort of naming and shaming and community outrage. More recently, and John and I were discussing this earlier in the day, very influential in all the interviews that I did was a book called No Shortcuts, Organising for Power by Jane McAlevey. And it's about her experience of organising the United States, but it's been of a lot of interest to activists here. She's done big seminars recently with teachers. She's done it before with union organisers. And I'm going to come back to evaluate this, but at the heart of her ideas is to move away from a servicing union, where the hierarchy acts on behalf of people through casework, through perhaps supplying some benefits, and moves towards organising and involving members themselves, putting them at the centre of action. And there are three strands to her argument. Firstly, identifying what she calls organic leaders, people who are the best activists, who are able to win over other workers. The importance of community in winning disputes, and that was very evident during the Chicago teachers' strike. And the third strand is something called a structure test, so that you can try and work out what sort of support you might have before you take high-risk strike action. And you might do that through a petition, perhaps an indicative ballot and so on. So we'll come back to that when I've gone through some of the disputes that I'm going to look at. Two other strategies, very briefly. Trade unions themselves have been much more concerned with thinking about how to organise workers that they haven't reached out to before and migrant workers. And I think it's fair to say that the record of British trade unions in the 1950s and 1960s was pretty appalling at organising migrant and Black workers. The 1970s, something called the Anti-Nazi League, a big, very popular anti-fascist movement, and a strike by women workers from Southeast Asia at Grunwick's actually was quite pivotal in mainstreaming anti-racism and anti-xenophobia. And I don't think we can underestimate how important those were. Of course, since 2004, and I know this is true of Ireland as well, but one big challenge was when Ireland and Britain opened up their borders, not because they were altruistic, because they had labour shortages, to workers from Eastern Europe. I don't know the numbers for Ireland, but in Britain, within a year, about 1 million workers arrived from Eastern Europe, mainly Poland, but other countries as well. They went to work in poorly unionised sectors, in warehouses, logistics, so-called hospitality. And this was both a challenge and an opportunity for the big unions like Unite and the GMB. Now, again, we can talk about this more later, but I would argue, and I don't know if this is controversial, because I did quite a lot of work on looking at Polish workers in Britain, I would argue that actually the British trade union movement at the top made quite positive noises and opened up some spaces for activists who did some really, really imaginative actions and movements to recruit and organise and integrate migrant workers. I realised how progressive these were when I went and did this talk in Scandinavia at union conferences, where other trade unions were much more fearful about migrant workers and far less positive than in the UK. So I say that with a bit of caution, but I have to say that I think the noises that were made at the top opened up, and the resources that they provided were very, very beneficial. Of course, that's not automatic. At the same time as you've got Unite, teaching English as a second language, welcoming migrant workers, another branch of their workers were on unofficial strike action, calling for British jobs for British workers. Now, that campaign took a different direction after arguments about xenophobia, but nevertheless, there is nothing automatic about solidarity. It has to be fought for. And the last development in Britain, and I'll just mention this very briefly, is that some workers, and I think it's mainly London-based, but not exclusively, frustrated by the lack of energy, let's say, and lack of alacrity of some of the big unions, have broke away to form the Independent Workers of Great Britain in 2013 and the United Voices of the World in 2014. So between them, they've only got about 5,000 members, but they had been very active in really reaching out to cleaners in outsourced organisations, in games workers. They've been quite successful, sex workers. So really brought quite a lot of energy to campaigning. And again, we might want to discuss whether that's a good thing or not. So I've raced through that, and people may well want to come back and debate some of those points. But what I'd like to focus on now is, depending on how the time goes, either 3 or 4 disputes where I've interviewed workers, union organisers, and 3 of them have had some really stunning victories, and 1 of them hasn't, and there are lessons to be learned from that. So I'm going to start off with women carers in Birmingham. And in May 2019, after taking 82 days of strike action over 2 years, they managed to get Birmingham Council to withdraw completely all of the proposals they were making to cut their hours and their incomes. Now, I mention these workers because these women were not precarious in the sense that they had 0 hours contracts, although lots of care workers do. But the precarious nature of their work lay in the fact that they were incredibly badly paid. Their incomes were really low. They were part-time workers, and the ones that I interviewed, I thought faced quite shocking hardship even when they were at work. And they had to remortgage their houses. They depended on overdrafts, going to the supermarket at 12 o'clock to get cheap deals, and getting into debt. Now, their employers had a whole arsenal of tricks to try and defeat their campaign. And it included, just to cut a long story short, of trying to split their shifts. So they were on duty for 14 hours a day, but got paid for 8 and had to hang around in between. It went through redundancies, quite often without union representation, and bullied at least 100 women out of jobs. And then, to add insult to injury, they commissioned consultants at a cost of £12 million to review care and elderly services. And in the worst kind of scientific management, consultants came back and said that all their contracts should be reduced by 14 to either 14, 21 or 22 hours a week. And that meant a really big reduction in hours and income for these women, which made them precarious. So they won, and there were 3 strands to them winning. One, there was strike action. And, not only were they on strike for 82 days, but these were not, and it was 2-hour strikes, went up to 5-day strikes. And these were not passive strikes. There were demonstrations, there were rallies. They really made their presence felt. Second strand was public support and solidarity. So Unison paid out 180,000 in strike pay, but they got an equal amount from the donations of other trade unions. So very, very important. And thirdly, this was a really long war of attrition by the council. And what the union did, and particularly the full-time organiser, is they organised a whole raft of other things to link the women's campaign into wider politics. They went to London and lobbied Parliament. Many of them had never left Birmingham. They lobbied the Labour Party. They led the protests at the Conservative Party conference. They sent delegation to the anti-Trump demonstrations. They sent delegations to stand up to racism. So they won. I'd stopped researching it before they won. And I was not optimistic because it was such a battle against the odds. And yet their persistence and tenacity meant the council completely backed down. Now, I don't know how many of you know about this dispute, but it's very hard to read about. And it's a really landmark win, I think, for women. So moving on, cleaners. Cleaners literally do the dirty work of neoliberalism, and they face a different sort of precarious work. They work in an industry where very often, not always, their work is outsourced to a merry-go-round of companies who merge, do takeovers, change their names, ditch contracts, pass them on with their workers who are moved around like so much human cargo. So, one problem is that quite often in one workplace, you've got workers who might be on, 5 or 6 different contracts. The ones that were there a long time ago would be on a slightly better contract, and as each firm took over, the contracts would get worse. In London, many of these workers were migrant workers, not necessarily so true elsewhere. So very, very difficult, precarious workers, fragmented, fractured, and yet there have been a whole number of really important victories. And this has been led probably by the campaign that took place at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, right in the centre of London. And they waged a campaign over 11 years and started in 2008. One-day strikes, petitions, lots of support from students. They eventually won the living wage, better terms and conditions, trade union recognition. Now, those were a little bit hard for management to stomach. So what they actually did is one day cleaners were told to turn up to work at 6:30. They were told to attend an emergency meeting, which was a way of luring them into a closed space. And several of them were arrested, detained, and deported. So those were the sort of tactics. that their firm, with the complicity of the university, were prepared to use to try and undermine their strike. Quite gobsmacking. But that didn't have the desired effect. Union recruitment increased, it spread to catering, to security. By 2013, they had 100% membership, and they had 7 trained members of Unison. They had a 48-hour strike in 2014, and eventually, in August 2018, they won. The employers agreed to bring cleaning and other services back in-house. Now, that was an 11-year struggle, and some of you might be thinking, bloody hell, we can't wait that long. But the point about their win is this, that it inspired whole groups of other workers. And in fact, London universities in particular have been like a pack of cards, and they've conceded one by one, even without a fight. But there's one other dispute that I'll mention very briefly, which I think is also important, which is that there's, in Britain, there's the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which it's quite a laugh. You go in and they talk about decent jobs and good work, and yet their cleaners, security staff, catering staff were all on these really poor contracts. To cut a long story short, in July, I'm trying to get the right year, 2019, 25 cleaners and 15 catering staff, only 40 workers, walked out on indefinite strike. And again, solidarity, collections, picketing, and the support of the Public and Commercial Services Union meant that after 12 weeks, their management had nowhere else to go, and they conceded all of the demands to these workers. And again, that's had the effect of inspiring confidence. And again, not a dispute that, as far as I know, has had a great deal of publicity. Right, John, how much longer have I got to go?
I'd say you just finished bang on time there, actually. But
have I? Right. Can I just have 5 more minutes if I'm really quick?
5 more minutes, but you have to keep your fingers pinned.
I really will be. I really will be quick. I was going to talk about the successes in the hospitality sector. We can talk about that during the discussion. I do want to say that not every attempt to organise has been successful. Sports Direct, named and shamed, subject of documentaries, a lot of campaigning, unfortunately did not have the same effect. It was disappointing. And I believe that was because it substituted for workers. It didn't manage to engage them. So the ingredients of success. Communities are important, as long as they are not substituting for workers, that they are supporting them in terms of solidarity. Rank and file workers with good union organisers is critical on the ground. And I think politics as well, because the disputes that were successful started off with small bread and butter issues, but what they finished by doing was linking workers into solidarity and the bigger politics and the bigger anger of the moment. So obviously I'll have to leave it there.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks, though, Jane. That's a fantastic introduction, and